For those of you who don't know, Reddit actually has a subreddit called Ask Philosophy. So we're going to take a look at that today and see if we can answer some of these questions. Why can't we choose different ethical systems for different situations? Ooh, good question. A layman asked me this question and it caught me off guard because I couldn't come up with a good answer as to why. It seems intuitive to me an individual can only choose one ethical system to abide by and apply it to all situations, but I can't seem to come up with any justification as to why I feel that way. The only refutation I could see is that choosing which scenarios deserve which frameworks could be problematic, but that seems more like a practical issue than a theoretical issue. For context, or an example, they suggested something along the lines of some consequentialist system for politics and other large-scale endeavors, and some deontological system for individual interactions and other small-scale endeavors. Any help is appreciated. This is a really interesting question. I don't think I've encountered this before. So my first response would be to ask the other person why they think that the correct moral theory would say such a thing. And if you don't have an argument, then I would say I have less reason to be convinced, right? So going back to the original question, why can't we choose different ethical systems for different situations? Well, I don't think that's impossible. I don't think that we can't do that. I would just need an argument as to why I should do that. All right, here's another question. Recommended reading as basis for discussing how to live a good life or the art of living. My partner and I want to add some depth into our view on what a good life is and what is important. We've had thoughts about how we currently lead our lives and in what direction we want to go, especially since we've gotten kids. Of course, we can just discuss those things by ourselves, but we thought it would be interesting to also challenge our views with different perspectives on the topic. What would you recommend? Preferably something that's not too heavy reading or that seems dated, even if it's not, as my partner isn't used to reading philosophy texts and will likely lose interest if it's too long or boring or difficult to get into. Would be very grateful to hear your thoughts. Good question. Okay, so my recommendation is The Best Things in Life by Thomas Herka. Okay, Thomas Herka, he's a perfectionist, and I believe he's a philosopher in Canada. And I think the book is really good. He talks about, I think, knowledge, achievement. He talks about pleasure. So he basically talks about things that are just supposed to be non-instrumentally good for you, right? Things that are good in themselves. If I remember correctly, the text is pretty accessible. So that would be my recommendation. Question on regulation of dress codes. Hello. Relatively recent protests in Iran on the state enforcement of hijab, and many people say that it's immoral and wrong because we shouldn't force someone without their consent. Now, this is a reasonable position. However, most, if not all, states have laws prescribing certain minimum clothing codes. Are those laws immoral too? Surely public nudity is wrong and there should be certain dress codes. But the question is, where should a government draw the line? I couldn't find an article about this on the SCP, so I came here. Thanks. For those of you who don't know, the SCP is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It is a great resource. Okay. All right, well, this is another good question. I don't think I've encountered this question before in any of my classes. So basically, the question is about just government coercion, right? It's about when the government is justifiably allowed to limit your freedom. Okay, so here are a couple of thoughts. So the first thing that came to mind was Joel Feinberg's offense principle, okay? So he wrote a book called Offense to Others, and he basically talks about when offense becomes a legitimate reason for government interference, okay? And basically he talks about weighing the interests of the person who wants to express themselves in that way versus the interests of the other people who find that expression offensive. And depending on how that calculus turns out, the state is justified or not justified in limiting that person's freedom. The other thing that came to mind is that it's not entirely clear to me that public nudity is wrong. Maybe public nudity, upon reflection, is actually morally permissible and the government should not prevent people from being publicly nude, right? Maybe, right? It all depends on the argument. Also, some places do allow people to be publicly nude, right? I think there are certain nude beaches. I don't know if there are in the United States, but I'm sure in some places they do allow nudity on beaches, right? So that's another thing to consider. Maybe what we can have is some sort of free expression zone of the country where people can walk around nude if they want. People can walk around without a hijab if they want, right? Maybe that's like a compromise. Okay, next one. Argument from authority question. I understand it's fallacious to assert that claim X is true just because an expert makes it, but I'm a bit confused as to when precisely using the claims of experts as the foundation of your argument crosses into fallacious territory. If a bridge was being built, it seems to me that logically, the experience and education a structural engineer has would make their argument for a particular design the most likely to be true. At what point does it become fallacious to say that the engineer's argument is stronger? Great question. So I would answer it like this. It's fallacious to say this argument is true just because this expert said it, right? That's fallacious, right? But it wouldn't be wrong to say this argument is more likely to be true because an expert said it, right? Those are two different things. How should you introduce kids into the philosophical or scientific way of thinking? Great question, great question. So I would actually say that children are born philosophical and they're born scientific, okay? And the reason why is because they are curious by nature. They want to understand how the world works. They want to understand why something happened. So because they already have that disposition in them, I think the best way to do this is to really just foster that curiosity, right? Because they are naturally going to ask why. And then you can give your best explanation, but maybe there are certain things that you don't understand. And so you pose your own questions to them. The other thing that I would do is to point out patterns and ask them why we observe certain patterns, okay? I think that's quite useful. So for instance, if you're at a playground, right, the children are generally running around, right? They're like super hyper, and the parents are not, okay? That's an observation, right? So one thing that you could do is to ask your kid why. Why do you think that's the case? What do you think is the cause of this, right? So pointing out patterns and then asking them why they think those patterns exist. Is it possible that most philosophers are right? It often seems to me like philosophers are not actually contradicting each other. Sure, there are always wackos in every field, but it seems like most philosophers debate two different perspectives of the same agreed idea. That is to say, they don't usually seem to disagree enough that one must be wrong in order for the other to also be right. Is that the case? That's a really interesting question. So from my experience, I think it is true that philosophers tend to disagree with each other a lot on a lot of things, right? But I think the disagreements may be exaggerated by this need to publish in professional philosophy. The way that you become a successful philosopher and a prestigious philosopher is if you publish a lot in prestigious journals, right? And in order for you to publish something, you have to make an original argument. And what that usually entails is that you poke holes in other people's arguments, right? You say, oh, this person's argument is wrong because they failed to consider this. And that might actually exaggerate the disagreements that philosophers have. Is the question why inherently a philosophical one? Great question. It seems like you can ask why ad infinitum, and proper answers lie only in the realm of philosophy, as in, why did the apple fall from the tree? Because of gravity. But why gravity? This is a great question. So my answer is yes. If you ask why enough times, the answer is going to be a philosophical one. So the way to think about it is this. When you are asking why, you're asking the cause of whatever that thing is, right? Why did the apple fall from the tree? What caused the apple to fall from the tree, right? Oh, well, gravity caused it. Okay, yeah, but why does gravity exist or something like that? And then now you're asking like a philosophical question, okay? Once you start asking for more fundamental causes, it naturally leads to philosophy. Philosophy deals with the most fundamental issues and questions of existence, right? So it would make sense for your why questions to eventually lead to philosophy. All right, well, I think I'm going to end it here. I really enjoyed answering philosophy questions on the internet. If you have any philosophy questions that you want to ask me, feel free to leave them down in the comments. I specialize in moral philosophy, so I won't be able to answer like your metaphysics questions or epistemological questions, all right? So just keep that in mind. All right, well, I hope you found it interesting, and I'll see you all next time.